Let me introduce you to Ambassador Alan Keyes, a former presidential candidate on 2 occasions. He ran for the U.S. Senate against none other than Barack Obama. He knows him very, very well. He is the antithesis of Barack Obama. He's my great friend. I admire him greatly. And Alan, welcome to the Third Continental Congress.
Thank you, Larry. I want to say, first of all, that I'm very proud and pleased to be standing with Larry Klayman. He's one of the only people that I know to whom I think applies with some truth the statement that when you meet someone who is fighting with all they have for a righteous cause, you have met a majority of one. And you've been out there constituting that majority for a long time, dedicating your life to it in a way that ought to both inspire admiration but also shame many of us. For though we live in a society that is based upon the premise of just such participation, not by people of special birth and background and wealth or even the special credentials of intellect and this and that kind of accomplishment. Only one accomplishment is needed in order, in fact, to qualify to be a citizen of the United States. And by this, I do not mean the technicalities of the Constitution and so forth and so on. I mean the understanding of citizenship that sees in each and every human being that capacity for self-government, which then becomes the aim and goal of our community and of our Constitution. And that qualification is actually quite simply that you be disposed to do right according to the endowment of God. That would have been universally understood practically in our society. Oh, I imagine there were some atheists hiding here and there. Some of them actually wrote fairly extensively during the period preceding the Revolutionary War and so forth. But guess what? There wasn't even one of them that did not acknowledge that it would be impossible to establish the form of government we have enjoyed if you did not acknowledge the superior standard of the Creator God. I start out there because I think every time we start out, we need to remember this. Otherwise, we are going to lose sight of something that is supposed to be a requirement when you think about the United States. And that every state in the Union is supposed to satisfy, and every citizen of the Union is supposed to take for granted. And it's not a small thing, and yet I think it's something that is no longer at all well understood. I was watching events over the course of the last several years, and the one that shocked me the most, I think, and that also should in fact be of greatest concern to us, is that in the last election, when the Attorney General Paxton and I think it was 22 other states, along with Texas, came forward and they presented to the Supreme Court their concern that in certain states there had been fraudulent elections. The court responded in an absolutely shocking way. It is, after all, right, a part of the federal government. What is one of the clear, plain requirements that touches the bedrock foundation of our whole political way of life in America, that is clear and plainly stated in the Constitution of the United States? The one job the federal government has, it's not the welfare job, it's not even just the job of protecting the territorial integrity and our borders and so forth and so on. The one thing that is most plainly and clearly stated is that the United States shall guarantee in each of the states a Republican form of government. It's clear as day. It's stated right there. Now, of course, that begs a question, doesn't it? What is a Republican form of government? After all, we live in an age when, over there in the Soviet Union before it died, it was called the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Would that have qualified as a republic in terms of the Constitution of the United States? A matter of fact, it's the People's Republic of China. Does that qualify as a republic under the Constitution of the United States? How are we to know? Well, I think the only way we can know is to consult those who wrote the Constitution, to consult the meaning of the term when they penned the document, when they set it forth. What did they mean by Republican government? Well, Madison says in the Federalist Papers that a Republican form of government is the form of government in which the scheme of representation takes place. Scheme being like schema, the plan that is based on what? And representation of whom? Well, for that, I think we need to consult history a little bit. But we would say, wouldn't we, in America, fairly nonchalantly, well, it's the representation of the people. Well, who are the people? I was reading the other day, a matter of fact, I have the habit of reading on July 4th. At some point during the day, I will reread Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. Why the Gettysburg Address? Because I think it's the most clear and forthright statement of this nation's dedication to government of, by, and for the people, stated in a context that makes it unequivocally clear that it is the vital lifeblood of our spiritual and moral commitment, the one for the sake of which the Civil War was in fact fought. And he talks there about the founding and things like of that kind, and makes the point toward the end that the whole purpose of the sacrifice goes to the meaning of that term that is in the Constitution of the United States and to the preservation of the fact that is mentioned in the United States. But as I was reading it this time, I was led to go back and chide myself, because I like to think that I have read through and thought about a lot of the things that are related to these important eras in American history. And as I was reading it through, it dawned on me, I have been so fascinated over the years with Abraham Lincoln that I never fulfilled a little promise that I made to myself. And that promise was that I was going to read in its entirety at some point in my life the speech that was given by the one who was actually designated as the speaker for that assemblage of people that were commemorating the deaths on the field of Gettysburg, right? What was his name? Do you remember the name of the speaker who was actually designated? He gave a fulsome oration. He spoke for 2.5 hours. His name was Edward Everett, and nobody remembers him. His speech lasted for 2.5 hours. Lincoln's speech lasted for a little over 2 minutes, and is among those things that even in this perverse and benighted time has yet to be forgotten. Why? Why? And what was it that was the focal point of his speech? It was the understanding of the cause of the war. Not the cause that they write about in the history books, and not even the cause that we are most likely to cite as the cause of slavery. No, the cause that preserves the United States is rather the cause of that understanding of righteous justice that allows one in the end to declare that slavery is wrong and to find in oneself the conscientious commitment to bring it to an end. And not, as some people are saying now. See, I find our present time to be almost totally benighted and inexcusable, even when people claim that they are doing good. All these people are out there claiming that by going around and pummeling slavery and talking about how we got to get rid of all the vestiges of slavery. I honestly believe that most of the people who are now running about after BLM and Antifa and claiming that they were so dead set against slavery, do you know why they want to get rid of every vestige of slavery in the United States? So that once we have forgotten that what slavery is about, once we have forgotten what it took to overthrow it, once we have forgotten how it really operated and what it really was, they will be able unequivocally to make it known to us that the form of government they have now imposed and that they mean to sustain is itself a form of that slavery. And it's not a form that discriminates against black folks or Asian folks or Native American folks. No, in their understanding of slavery, all human beings are indeed created equal, for we shall all of us equally be their slaves. How can they believe that that's going to happen? It shouldn't be able to happen. Why? Well, because the thing that I remember most was agreed on by the founders is that the word republic, in conformity with what was written by Madison, is based on representation. Representation of whom? Representation of the people, but not the people as were the demos in Athens. You do realize that demos, that's the Greek word for people, from whom, by the way, or at least in part, the Democrat Party takes its name, yes? Demos kratos. And I don't know, a lot of people, when you talk about that word democratic, they use it as if it means the rule of the people. You would think it corresponded to government of, by, and for the people. And that somehow or another those two things were synonymous. That one being a longer version of the word democratic. And the way people throw it carelessly around in our context, you would really believe that it means that. But it doesn't. Okay? Demos kratos referred to the power of the people. And to say that because of that phrase, you are dealing with a government of, by, and for the people, a government guided by the people, a government inspired by the people, a government that reflects the people, would be like saying that because there's gasoline in the tank, it determines where the car goes. The gasoline in the tank does not determine where the car goes. It provides the kratos, the power that drives the car in this or that direction once the one who is driving has determined where it goes. But in the true sense of the term, the word republic, as used by the founders of the United States, was a reference to a form of government in which the whole people is to be consulted about the fundamental decisions that determine where the car goes, what it does when it gets there, and the standard by which doing it rightly and doing it wrongly will be judged. All those things must be included. Otherwise, you're not the guide. So where do we get our idea of when we read the Constitution and we're looking at all these various things that are included in the Constitution, why are they there? Why is it framed in the first place, not in the simple way that seems to be the best way to achieve the most effective results when you're organizing human beings? Most of us would be inclined, just on a common sense basis, to think that when you really need to get something done, like, for instance, saving the life of your nation, you would want a good, clean plan, and you would want to have one directing will. Everybody would get together cohesively and pursue that plan. Dictatorship sounds just fine when that's what you're after. And yet dictatorship was precisely what the founders intended to avoid. And they, even knowing the history of the Roman Republic, even being steeped in the reality that every now and again you might face a crisis where just that kind of cohesion and just that kind of direction was required, they thought it so dangerous that the whole point of the government would be to hedge about the one who would be entrusted with providing that cohesion so that he could or she could be called to account and limited so that they would not trample on what? On our rights. But here's the rub. See? Because when you look at the Declaration of Independence, it turns out that that reference to rights, which has, by the way, been powerfully important in our society. It's the only thing that I think, if you look even at the discourse today, the word right and rights, these words are used on both sides. Everybody's trying to convince everybody else that they're out there championing rights. Of course, you have one side championing some peculiar rights, but nonetheless, they say that they're rights. They champion the right to kill innocent human beings. Most of us would find calling that right a little bit exceptionable, but they don't, right? But that means that somewhere along the way, we lost our sense of what is the core meaning of that word right. And I say we've lost it because I see it all the time. I don't know whether FDR intended this to happen or whether it quietly reflected something that subconsciously, if not consciously, he knew was going on. But when he made the Four Freedoms speech and acted as if we were sending people out into wars in order to die for freedom, he forgot one really essential point. While every right involves the use of freedom, not every freedom is an exercise of right. And therefore, the two words are not at all synonymous. The distinction must be ever kept in mind. And in the Declaration of Independence, it was. It's the reason, by the way, that I believe it is one of the main objectives of those who are presently attacking and overthrowing our government to make sure they somehow manage to erase the prime importance of the Declaration from the memory and consciousness of the American people. It must be gone, because once it is gone, that question of the distinction between freedom and right will no longer be determined by a word that refers to righteousness. It will instead, like the name of the Democrat Party, be determined by a word that refers to power, and power alone. So that at the end of the day, it will be power that determines exactly what the people will enforce, or at least what will be enforced in their name. Think through what I'm explaining and you realize, well, wait a minute, that means that the kind of government they have in communist China, democratic, is truly a democratic form of government. It abuses and organizes the power of the people under the rule of a little clique that then determines how that power is to be used. Is that an understanding compatible with the Constitution of the United States? Not in the least, because that's not the meaning of the word republic in the Constitution. The Democratic People's Republic of China is all about exploiting the power of the people in order to subdue and subjugate the people themselves. It's brilliant, but it's not representation. Since I think if you consulted most people, they would much rather be living a responsible life according to their proper choices than to be living a life subjected entirely to the choices of others, with no possible respect even for their humanity. So I want to point to the fact that, to me, the key of our present dilemma is that we have allowed ourselves to forget the Declaration and its real meaning. And every time I hear our politicians, and this is what they mainly do, they get out there all the time, and what are they talking about? Even when you have one or two of them who on the 4th of July will remember that the Declaration of, that the day, July 4th, is not the day on which we commemorate the decision that the colonies, the 13 colonies, are and of right ought to be free That decision was not made on the 4th. That decision and that vote was definitively taken on the 2nd of July. What happened on the 4th of July was that they approved what we might call today the press release, the media release, the thing that explained what was going on so that the whole world would understand its meaning. The founders thought the explanation more important as a permanent cause of attention and celebration than the act. The act, they could not be sure, in fact, would be sustained. But the Declaration of Independence, they were sure, was sustained and could possibly be sustained throughout all time and in all places because it seconded the motion not of human will, not of human judgment, and not of human understanding, but of the Creator God, of the God who is the author of the laws of nature and of nature's God, of the God who is the author of our very being and all the things that incline us this way and that give us the considerations that eventually must govern our choices if we are to preserve ourselves. So the Declaration is supposed to be the focus so that people will remember that our way of life is not about the money and it's not about the power. It is about the justice. It is about the right, but not the right to do as you please, but that right according to God, which it is our responsibility to exercise, to carry out, to make sure that we do it. That's the right that is the focal point of the Declaration. And it's also supposed to be the focal point of our government, the focal point of our deliberations as a people, the focal point of our choices. They are to represent our commitment to right according to the endowment of God's will. That's almost literally what the Declaration says, and it is accurately, exactly what it means. And we have forgotten it. I'm sorry, I have met many people, including people, by the way, who would call themselves really committed conservatives and libertarians and all of this, and they have forgotten that the heart of our liberty is not freedom. The heart of our liberty is the commitment to do right according to God's endowment, to do right according to God's will. And that means that if we are to sustain a Republican form of government, we have to sustain that fundamental commitment, or the constraints upon government can neither be understood nor applied. Why? For a very simple reason. You can't make a decision about when and how government should be constrained if you have forgotten absolutely the standard that allows you to distinguish right from wrong. And that's where we are right now. All kinds of things going on around us now, all kinds of legislation being proposed and so forth and so on, all in the name of somehow we're going to protect the rights of gay people. We're going to protect the rights of all these different kinds of predilections. We're going to protect the rights of women to call themselves men and men to call themselves women, in utter derogation of a simple truth that at some level that we cannot control and do not change, it is not our will but God's will that determines certain distinctions in this universe. And the first distinction it determines is the distinction between ourselves and God Almighty. It is God who has made us, and not we ourselves. But here we are now in the depths of folly, because we actually have become so enthralled with that word freedom that it is here and now being used to cast away the standard without which we cannot understand and apply the limits of power. And once we get to the position where we have lost that standard, what decides every outcome? Who has the most power? And what is the characteristic of every communist, socialist, fascist socialist, Nazi socialist government that has ever existed? That the only thing that matters under those forms of government is power. There is no standard of right but power. And yet how many of us have forgotten, even amongst people who call themselves conservatives and they claim to be all in favor of liberty, they just forget that liberty in the Declaration is not liberty understood as licentious freedom. It is liberty defined in terms of our responsibility to do that which accords with the will of God, that which accords with the activity of our Creator. See that? Throw that away, and you live in a maelstrom in which every now and again something coheres into a unified community, but it is unified by fear. It is unified by torture. It is unified by mass murder. It is not unified by the commitment to right. We keep going down this road, and we are perishing. We shall perish. And if they succeed in their will, we shall perish, and those who come after us will be deprived of any means of knowing that we were ever here. For once the truth is known, it will be followed. And therefore, the regimes that do not follow it will make sure it is never known again. Hitler dreamed of a Reich that could last 1,000 years. As they do not believe in God, these worshipers of power believe in regimes that will last forever and that will become an endless cycle in which abusive power after abusive power succeeds itself in order to work the hellish misery of all humanity. This is what to me is the most tragic thing about some of the discussions that are going on amongst us right now, including this ridiculous discussion over what they call critical race theory. Now, I know that amongst these intellectuals, they have some fancy way of misleading people about what is the meaning of the word critical. What is the meaning of the word critical? I mean, Kant had a way of using the word criticism, which actually meant that you are parsing things in such a way that you really come to understand what is the fundamental way in which they operate. And that's supposed to be, by the way, one of the things that's at the root of our science, isn't it? That's the approach that you take. And it may have surprised some folks who were out there being all secularist and thinking that we could do without God, when suddenly these worshipers of science find themselves in a world in which fundamental aspects of the human person are being decided by whims. The whim, I feel like a man. I feel like a woman. Oh, God made you a woman, so you couldn't be a man. But I am because I feel like it. Do you realize that these are discussions that are now determining outcomes in our society, though we cannot think of them without recognizing that they are insane? We are accepting them. We are intimidated by them because we have forgotten the logic of God that is the foundation as well of our understanding as of our polity. We have no hope in either respect if we do not restore the sane belief that there is an authority beyond our authority and a will beyond our will that allows us to comprehend the complex schemes that actually govern the universe insofar as we are able, and that forbid us to deny that we have somehow found a way that allows us to gratify our passions and achieve our sexuality and achieve our other goals without regard to those determinations made by the understanding that goes beyond ours, because it comprehends the realities and the forces and the energies that we do not yet comprehend, that we may never comprehend. And I find it amazing that we are now letting this happen in the midst of our arrogant celebration of the little we have discovered. We've kind of lifted up the skirts of God's knowledge of the universe and are claiming that now we understand everything. How can we make such a claim? There were people living in the vicinity of deathly radiation as short a time ago as the 19th century. Did they have any idea what they were doing? Of course not, because we had not, with our little understanding yet, promoted an understanding. We could not, as it were, intellectually see the forces that are at work in the forms of energy that can then slay human beings without ever being seen. There are all these folks who say, well, I don't believe in God because I don't believe in invisible this and that. And I'm saying we live in a world in which we are right this minute surrounded by invisible this and that. Our eyes cannot see them. But even now they are carrying what our eyes see so that it can be seen by millions if they choose to gather. This should be a humbling thought. Why? Because if there were things we didn't understand yesterday that were killing us because of our ignorance, what about all the things that we have not understood yet, that we will not understand until tomorrow, that we may not understand ever, which are killing us just as definitely, though we do not know the cause? One of the things that I thought was pretty brilliant about the founders of this country was that when they founded the United States, they had a choice to make. And though we ignore it, and when we don't ignore it, we then try to use it as a stick with which to beat them. So, what is one of the most important sticks that's used to beat the founders? It's the reason why we should tear down George Washington's statue. Don't pay attention to the wisdom of Thomas Jefferson. Doesn't matter if he said 2 and 2 is 4. We better suspect that's a lie because he was a slave owner. I bet even slave owners were fairly careful about adding numbers. And that occasionally they even subscribed to understandings that they could not escape because they conscientiously believed scientifically and in terms of the operation of the logic of our understanding that those conclusions were inescapable. In the case of the Declaration of Independence, and the more I have read, by the way, I preface this statement by talking about the fact that we all have to remedy our ignorance. I spent a good deal of my time reading at one point about the history of the Constitution, the history of what was going on in America, other things, history of the Civil War. I love reading history. But it wasn't general history. It was history focused on the things that had to do with the United States. Lately, I've been broadening the scope because I keep encountering things that require, like, for instance, the claim that we should assume that white folks are somehow responsible for slavery, and that every time I see a white person, that's the slaver. Did they ever own a slave? No. No. Did they ever sell a slave? No. Did they ever benefit from slavery? No, they did not. Did they ever slog through fields of blood in order to end slavery? Yes, they did. Did they ever fight against monstrous regimes in order to prevent slavery? Yes, they did. But I am supposed to conclude that they are slavers just because of their color of their skin. And this insanity is being imposed upon us now. And yet, when we look at the founding, I would have to tell you, they started out with a viewpoint that would probably have made life easier if they were just wicked, deep-dyed people out there to gain power and get money and do whatever they had to, enslaving human beings right, left, and center, no matter what. That all they had to do was stick with the understanding they had before they looked into it, the light of the Christian understanding and the light of the logic of justice required by that understanding. They could have rejected it all, but they did not. And do you know what that accounted for? It accounted for the difference between what they wrote when the discussion of British tyranny first started where when you read the pamphlets, it's all about how they are being violated in their rights according to the common law, according to the rights of Englishmen, according to the Magna Carta, right? Narrowly focused on what was achieved in the context of the history of this particular race. But by the time they wrote the Declaration, they wrote a piece that in thinking of the transformation, I often have to choke back tears of thanks to Almighty God. For the Declaration is not written about the rights of Englishmen. It's not written about the rights of white people or black people or Native Americans or people of this you and that you, this famous state like China or some other state. No, it's not written about any of that. It is written first about the authority of God, and it's written second about God, how God sees us, not as this race and this nation and that nation, but as the one whole that he created, the one human race that he meant us to be. We appear in a panoply of different shades and backgrounds and even somewhat our inclinations, but we have another common ground, which is the common ground of our obligation to our Creator God. An obligation that in the end inclines us to look upon one another as kindred, to look upon one another in such a way as for all the differences, we can yet see ourselves in everyone else, and see that now more than humanity ever has before in the history of the world. Why then are we in the midst of a period when certain forces are trying to get us to re-narrow our vision, to think that because it is in retribution for the terrible crime of slavery, black people should now think only of their vengeance and claim the privilege of persecuting those who are not today even their tormentors, whatever their ancestors were 100 or 200 years ago. Sorry. This is a way to make us all blind. Oh, we'll be alive to every difference, every nuance of color, to every perpetration of so-called atrocity. But we will be blind to the common ground, to the hopeful ground, to the common heart, to the true heart that is in the end not just our heart for one another, but God's heart for us all. The question before us now, I believe, as a people, though it will figure, if you apply what I'm trying to say to these different areas that we're now debating about, you'll find that it has this wonderful way of resolving the picture. You will understand that Ben Carson and I will have to include myself in this because I call it drivel critical race theory. He called it a bunch of garbage, but it's a mess no matter what you call it. See? And we shouldn't be taken in by it or by anything that takes us back to the simple nostrum that is really at the heart of Marx, at the heart of all the communist isms there ever were. And that is the simple philosophy that might makes right, that power determines truth, and that because we have the power, you shall be subject to our truth. Well, I, for one, am still an American, and I thank God for the founders who made us as a people to be a people who do not just acknowledge our truth as individuals. We acknowledge the truth of God that applies to us all, that preserves us all, and that mandates that in each and every one of us there is a kernel of God's intention that must be respected by every law, that must be respected by every court, that must be respected by every executive, by whatever name they are called, because we mean to remain a free people. Not in the sense that we are free to do as we please and to pretend and enforce upon others the sick imaginings of our lustful hearts, rights. No, that is not our freedom. No, I will say it unequivocally, even for those who do not acknowledge it. Yet we still, right this minute, enjoy the special warrant of God's grace to stand fast in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, wherewith God has made us free, free in such a way that no human power can ever claim rightly to trample upon us when we walk the path of God's righteousness, doing for ourselves and our own, doing for ourselves and our country, doing for ourselves and all of humanity insofar as we can effect it, that which God requires of us. I think this is the true vocation of our country, and our task now is to revive the sense of it so that we may discard the dross that does not consist with that simple, clear, plain understanding and stand upon the common ground that has built us up into the most envied nation on earth. That is why they are all coming against us. But if we stand fast in that liberty, which is truly grounded, then we'll beat them back. And we will stand once again, not as their conquerors, not as their enslavers, but as those who invite them to enjoy what for a moment we could begin to envisage in truth, the future that God intends for those whom he called into existence under the rubric of our humanity, not so that we could triumph in our own power, but rather glory in the power of our God.